Hi everyone, so welcome to session 3, and this is when we're going to talk about supporting children and families. So our learning objective for this session is to consider how being trauma informed will impact on the way that we interact and the way that we provide services to the people who we are funded to support. So one of the kind of simple ideas, I guess, but it's not simple to actually do in practice, is to kind of move away from that there's something sort of wrong with you model, which often is kind of it comes from a sort of a medical model approach, to thinking more about what's happened to you. So recognizing that the way people respond is often related to their history. And so it's their brain and their body reacting to what's happened to them and is in that state of kind of protecting us. And so we are thinking about a survival response and an adapted response that can be readapted. So we're inviting you to think about survivors as being just that, that they are survivors of abuse and harm, and that they're reacting in a way that they are still in that state of fear and a lack of trust. So what we often have, and you think of the education system, for example, it's not really set up to support traumatized children. Because those children, for example, will really struggle with being in a room with lots of people. They might struggle with noise. They might struggle with tasks because that, prefrontal cortex processing bit of the brain isn't working to its optimum level because there are things that are too triggering around that child. And so the kind of emotional and psychological damage that's come from the trauma, then creates the behavior problems that we see. Because the children are dysregulated, we're in the class, and then they get punished for that, punished for the responses that they can't really help in those moments. It's just their brain and their body reacting to not feeling safe. And then, of course, that creates more trauma. So maybe some of the punishment might be isolating a child from its friends, or from the other students, and maybe, spending time on their own. And that again can be really traumatic and a reminder of other punishments that they've had in the past, which then re-traumatizes them more. So we kind of get stuck in this sort of cycle of trauma. And we see that in adult services as well, in how we respond, that people might experience how we are responding to them as a punishment for something that, is an adapted response from a time where they were frightened and had to kind of find a way to survive. So Sheena Webb, who's a clinical psychologist, has created this, helpful pyramid of the foundations that we need to benefit from the interventions that we're offering people. So people aren't going to be able to problem solve with us unless they fundamentally feel safe first. So we have to make sure that we're creating safety for that person within our systems. And then if they feel safe, then we can work on, the emotional regulation. So can their brain and their body be in a place that then, enables them to feel safe? Are they in their window of tolerance? Then from there, they can connect with us and they can receive, some of the information that we're relaying or some of the questions that we're asking. That then gives them the ability to reflect on themselves and what's happening in their lives or what has happened in their lives, that then allows them to problem solve, and then they can put the actions in. But all of these things have to happen before we have action. So you can see that there's a lot behind that maybe we miss, and often we'll go straight into seeing people and then an action, and they're just, people's brains and bodies aren't ready for that when they've had experiences of trauma. So it's useful, I think, to understand what recovery from trauma might look like when we're thinking about supporting children and families, and that there are key things that influence recovery. They are feeling safe, which I've mentioned many times, relationships, having good, trusting relationships that are collaborative, where there's choice, where people feel connected, they feel heard, they feel understood, and then help to process experiences, to process their history and process what's happening to them in the present. So adults can talk these things over, and they can use, those experiences to create safe memories. But children don't have the same capacity for talking and to be able to understand things in that way. They have to do it through play. So children make sense of the world through stories and through playing out their experiences. So play and having access to play and imaginative creative play is really fundamental for children and trauma recovery. Let's have a look then at Judith Herman's 3-stage recovery model. So the first stage that she witnessed people go through in her research, mainly with women who'd experienced domestic abuse, but it's since been applied to plenty of other groups of traumatized people. Everybody basically needs to feel safe and have a period of stabilization which allows their brain and body to settle. So that's having safe housing, having routines and boundaries, having good nutritious food to eat, having your basic needs met, clothes, food, sleep, and a community around you. The basic things, routines, knowing what's coming next, no surprises, just being able to predict what's happening, because the brain likes to be able to predict and it works in pattern matching. So this is a stage which requires then to have consistent relationships within that as well. And some people, it might take a long time being in phase 1 to be able to start to trust people, to be able to start to get into routines and start to kind of have a relationship where you might be able to start to tell somebody and take the risk of letting them into your terrifying internal world. And when we've got one of those relationships, then that can be a bridge into other relationships. So when we're thinking about how do we show people that we are trustworthy and that they can be safe with us, there are some ways that we can deliberately phrase our conversations. So for example, being really transparent. The reason I'm asking you this is because this is the assessment process and this is what it's going to mean to you, so that people fully understand. Don't forget that the prefrontal cortex bit of the brain will work a lot slower if they don't feel safe. So we have to give people time and explain things really clearly and repeat things, and help them understand that we're really listening through providing empathy, for example. So if someone is talking about, or we're talking about something that's really painful, that we acknowledge that and say things like how much courage that must have taken for you to disclose that, because that sounds like a very frightening experience that you've been through, and I can't imagine what that must have been like, and how courageous you are to be here today, and to be curious about how they are today. So I wonder what it's like for you coming into this building, where difficult things have happened in the past. How does that feel for you? Do you get any reactions in your body when you come in the room, or what kind of thoughts do you have before you're came in today? So just being really curious, be very flexible. So if you've got something wrong, repair that by acknowledging that you got it wrong and that you misunderstood, and that you really want to get it right. You really want to understand what's happening for people, and we're acknowledging that it takes a lot to do what you're doing today, and so thank you so much for trusting me with that piece of information. I'm really, really sorry that happened to you, and that it sounds really, really upsetting. So we're validating people's experiences, we're showing compassion, we're being grateful that people have told us those things, because we recognise that it's a really big deal. We can normalise people's experiences by saying that many people feel this way after trauma, and I wonder if it would be helpful to hear from other people around that. We can also help by showing mentalisation, when we can explain to people through our conversations that maybe they interpreted us as angry, but actually we weren't angry. What we were was we were inquiring or we were curious, but maybe they saw it as anger. So being able to help people and make that kind of mental leap of understanding what's really going on when their brain is on high alert and perhaps seeing your neutral face as an angry face. So we're trying to help people go from that kind of space of rupture to a space of repair, and using compassion, validation, flexibility, curiosity, transparency. All of these things will be really helpful in that way. So that was phase 1, and now let's look at phase 2. So this is integration, where we're learning about how to control and manage our physiological reactions to our trauma, and also where we might process the story of the trauma. So we're trying to make sense of what happened to us, and we're trying to find ways of thinking and seeing the world that help us create our story. And our story is the narrative, and that's making sense of our symptoms, making the link between what happened to us and where we are now, but also trying to remember the positive things as well that happened to us in our lives, as well as the negative things, because being able to recover is to being able to live with what happened to us and make sense of what happened to us and find a way to cope with that, because it's not going to go away. We just have to find a way to live with it, basically. So Research in Practice have done a really useful booklet called Trauma Informed Approaches with Young People, and that they call it Helping Children Translate the Unspeakable into Words. So often children, and adults will have very limited capacity to being able to describe what happened to them. So can we help them do that through art? Can we help them do that through other creative means? Can we help them do it through other people's stories or poetry or songs, or find ways to express what's happening to them in a way that's meaningful to them, so that they can find a way to process it. So then when we've made sense of the story and kind of got our story and managed the physical reactions around our story, then we are in a place where we can learn to adapt in new ways to what's happening, in our lives. So that's about helping people make friendships, maybe join groups, manage conflict in friendships, to be able to believe that they have capacity to do things and that they are able to, manage their lives and have nice times and have fun and have, good relationships and do nice things. And that all comes through trusted relationships. So helping people work on things like anger management, relational conflict, romantic relationships, helping them understand relationships and themselves in relationships will be a part of that kind of challenge in phase 3. How then can we use this recovery model idea and the theories that we've looked at in the way that we work? So some of the things that we can do is we can think about the kind of choice, trust, power, control, those areas. And we can think about how could we, for example, be more empowering in the way that we work? Do we genuinely consult with people? And how could we do more of that? How can we increase our understanding about trauma with this child or parent or carer? And how can we help educate them about their own understanding of the trauma? So there's lots of things that we can do in that kind of fundamental basics around trauma, because if we don't get those right, then we won't be able to do the more complex work. If we don't get the kind of foundations of trust and empowerment and collaboration in there first. So for example, think about somebody who often is outside of their window of tolerance, a child or an adult. Could you, for example, talk to them about where would be the best place to have the conversation that you need to have? What's the best way of being able to get their brain and body into a state of calm? Would it be that you have a walking, discussion with them, because walking helps the brain and the body regulate? Maybe we could do it through drawing. Maybe we could have a game, if it's a child, for example, before we have a conversation. because people who have struggled with trauma symptoms will have difficulties processing. So can we make sure that we write stuff down, break it up into small chunks, find ways to help them process what's needed. And often there might also be things like ADHD or autism in the mix with many people that we're supporting. So we need to think about people's learning styles and how they're going to process that information most effectively. Can we take a strengths approach, a positive approach to people's experiences of trauma and ACEs? Can we really praise and understand people for the fact that they've managed to survive, and that they're still, growing and developing and learning, even though they're having to manage all of these difficult things that have happened to them? Can we really emphasize, what skills they will have learnt and they will have had to have adapted to, to survive what they've been through? And can we kind of think about resilience and what it means to be resilient, and how we can understand from the research around resilience, help people find ways to cope and manage what's happening to them, because we can't change the past, but we can help them find ways to cope and manage what they have now. So, for example, taking a positive approach to trauma and ACEs might be with children, for example, or adults. It might be about helping them understand the idea of flipping the lid, or the upstairs brain or the downstairs brain. We can teach people about brain plasticity so that they know that they won't always have to feel like this or respond like this, that there's other ways that their brains can learn to adapt, and that can be, that can be changed with repetition and trusting relationships. So here's some examples of pictures that children have drawn about how their brains work and what the upstairs and downstairs brains are and what's going on in their brain and their body. One thing that's really useful that I found really helpful was learning different breathing techniques. So that might be, with children, a really nice one to do is belly breathing. So you can get like a little soft toy or a toy that they really like, and they lie down and they make the teddy move. So you imagine that the teddy, for example, is on the ocean in a nice safe boat, and every time you breathe in and expand your belly, the boat rises and the teddy rises, and then when you breathe out, the teddy drops down a bit and the belly drops down towards the spine, and they basically watch their teddy going up and down as if they're on the waves, and that then teaches them to do like really good belly breathing, which calms the nervous system down. Or you could also teach the smell of flower and blow the wheel. So the smelling the flower requires that you take a big breath in through your nose, and the blowing the wheel then requires that you take a excuse me, a long breath out. So again, both of those breathing practices will tell the brain that you're safe, and that will then change what the body is doing, and it will calm down the kind of nervous system response. So maybe do a little bit of research on different breathing techniques. I will talk about them in this session as well, but try them on yourself and see if you think it makes a difference. And then when we do them ourselves, then we can teach them much more effectively. There's also some really nice cards called yoga pretzels, which if you are working with children and families, they're really nice things that you can teach families to do together, and they're really self-explanatory. And there's bumblebee breathing here as an example. So when you come back in, I'm going to ask you in a bit to think about somebody, adult or a child, that you're supporting at the moment and where they might sit in the trauma model. So you might want to go back and have a look at the different phases to remind yourself, because we will be asking you to talk about that in group work. All right, everybody, thank you so much, and I'll see you shortly.